There are many rightly famous stories about Moses in the Bible. But one part of his life gets very little attention, and I think it has a message for us about the nature of calling, namely that God's calling always involves a community. God's calling is always for some distinct aspect of the greater good. And while we may be called to one particular task within it, God does not call anyone to do the whole thing. Our callings are to one piece that's within a greater whole that we may or may not be able to see. The book of Exodus brings us right into the drama in chapter 1 of the plight of the Hebrews, who were enslaved in Egypt based on a lie from Pharaoh. We pay lots of attention to the story of Moses' birth, how he ends up as a baby in a basket floating down the Nile and found by Pharaoh's daughter who raises him. There's less attention to Moses murdering an Egyptian who he saw beating an enslaved Hebrew man, which is why we find Moses then fleeing Pharaoh into the wilderness, because Pharaoh didn't take kindly to that murder. Moses is in that wilderness in the region of Midian for 40 years before the burning bush episode, where God calls him to go back to Egypt to free his people. We're going to dive into that burning bush story this fall, but 40 years is a long time, and Moses used it to build a life. In Midian, Moses gets married. He marries a woman named Zipporah, the daughter of a priest named Jethro, and they have 2 sons. And Moses spends his days tending Jethro's flock of sheep. When Moses gets his call to return to Egypt to free his people, that's a dangerous gig, and Zipporah and the boys go back to stay with Jethro while Moses and his brother Aaron go do their thing in Egypt. Once that's done, and the Hebrews are on their way to the Promised Land, they make an extended stop and set up camp near Midian, where Jethro comes to meet them, bringing Zipporah and the boys back to Moses. Jethro then prepares a sacrifice and a feast to celebrate the liberation and all the miracles that God has done in getting them out. As the Israelites are camped there, Jethro watches his son-in-law, who once tended his sheep, now tending people. And that is the nut of this morning's passage. And we see that one of the jobs Moses has in his new reality is to settle disputes within his human flock. But there are a lot of them. This is a big flock. And there's a lot of both people and therefore disputes. And Jethro sees Moses sitting outside from dawn until dark with lines out the door of people waiting to see him to settle their issues. While Moses' heart is in the right place, Jethro can see immediately that this is not going to be a tenable solution for the long haul. And he takes Moses aside to say, "Man, what are you doing? You are going to burn out, and the people will grow resentful waiting for resolution to their issues, and it's just not going to be good if you keep this up." Jethro then gives Moses some sage advice. Get help. You heard it in the reading. Quote, you should represent the people before God, and you should bring their cases before God. Teach them the statutes and instructions, and make known to them the way they are to go and the things they are to do. You should also look for able men among all the people, men, and they didn't let women do that then. You know, probably part of the problem. But men who fear God, are trustworthy, and hate dishonest gain. Set such men over them as officers over thousands, over hundreds, over 50s, and over 10s. Let them sit as judges for the people at all times. Let them bring every important case to you, but decide every minor case themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people will go to their home in peace." Close quote. And then comes the line that shows us one of the reasons I think God chose Moses for the incredible leadership position that he was given at the burning bush. Chapter 18, verse 24. "So Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he had said." There should be an entire semester in seminary devoted to this story, as well as a full-on curriculum for congregations to learn its lessons. The bulk of the work of the church must be done by the laity, not the pastor, or the pastor will burn out and the congregation will become resentful because the pastor does not have time to deal with anything but the very largest concerns. Now, we will return to that in a minute because it's very Wesleyan. But back to Moses and Jethro first. Without any pushback, Moses puts Jethro's whole system into place. And once Jethro sees that it's working, Jethro goes back home. We all focus on Moses, and most churchgoers would be hard-pressed to say who Jethro even was. But the little-known priest in a wilderness region who took in a refugee fleeing a murder charge, trained him in humility, mindfulness, empathy, and strength by putting him to work tending sheep, who took care of Moses' wife and children while Moses was fulfilling a greater calling, and who had the wisdom and courage to tell the man who had just bested Pharaoh that he was going to wreck the whole project if he didn't get some help. Jethro's calling was critical to Moses' success. And because Moses was willing to listen, to admit he could not do it alone, and to adopt a new system of governing the people that relied on a much larger group of people to fulfill different roles, they were able to make it through as a people. There were still disputes. There was a downright mutiny at one point, which God settled with a miracle. But the lesson of Jethro still held and was expanded when God gave Moses the instructions for building the tent of meeting and the tabernacle and how to structure worship in the community. It is also notable that once Jethro had finished his mission to deliver Zipporah and the boys to Moses and to help Moses shift his role away from becoming a new kind of Pharaoh where Moses would decide everything to a more inclusive model, Jethro went home. He didn't sow division in the ranks and try to claim the mantle of leadership for himself because he came up with this great new idea. He didn't travel with the Israelites and try to be a backseat driver for Moses. Jethro did his part and then stepped back into his larger life's work as a rural priest, serving the people. And I'm sure that even in that much smaller role, Jethro didn't do his work alone either. His advice to Moses, I believe, was born from experience. The structure they adopted, with Moses choosing leaders who could then be in charge of layers of people, officers over thousands, and then under that, officers over hundreds, and then 50s down to 10s. Just do the math. That implies a ton of people to be managed and a lot of brand new leadership positions to do the work. I guarantee you that the only cases Moses dealt with himself were the ones that the people in charge of the thousands couldn't handle. Jethro gets a whole chapter of the Bible to help set that up and get it running smoothly. And you know where they moved their camp next? Mount Sinai, where they receive the commandments from God that will serve to guide all of those leaders in their work. Moses, yes, but also the ones in charge of thousands, the ones in charge of hundreds, the one in charge of 50s, and the one in charge of just 10. Whatever your calling turns out to be, whether it's a career or just a particular task at one stage of life or one day of life, it's not biblical to assume that any of us is called to a task alone. Whatever we're called to do is part of something larger, whether we can see it or not. And there are others also being called to do some piece of that same work. Jesus didn't even do it alone. God called men and women to travel with Jesus and to support him in a myriad of ways. Sometimes those people fell down on the job, and Jesus did have to endure some things alone. But that wasn't the plan. The plan was, those disciples who fell asleep in Gethsemane, the plan was for them to stay awake, not to leave him on his own in prayer. The same message goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when God has Adam participate in creation by naming the animals, and then puts him in the middle of the garden and tells him to serve and protect the earth, the vocation for all of us as human beings. Even when it comes to saving the world, God doesn't just pull out a magic wand and fix it, although that would have been very handy. God uses the much longer, dicier, and very, very inefficient route of working through human beings in human history to bring the reign of God in heaven, from heaven to earth. The Word didn't become law imposed from on high. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Like any good teacher, even God has modeled the truth that it takes all of us together in interlocking pieces to create the beloved community that the prophets spoke of. The notion that the governing structure of a body should reflect a theological truth is something that John Wesley understood and that's baked into our United Methodist system. We make our decisions through holy conferencing. And later in the service, Colin will tell us how that went at our annual conference last week. You will never attend the annual conference and say, this is definitely the most efficient way to get things done. But it is by design. God didn't set up the world to run that way, and our church is not set up that way either. Unlike my colleagues in other denominations, I am not ordained just to preaching the word, administering the sacraments, and serving the people. Although I have resented it many times over, every elder in the United Methodist Church is also ordained to ordering the life of a congregation, to ensure that the administrative structure of the church is thoroughly integrated with our theology, so that there is no distinction between our administrative functions and ministry. Ministry encompasses all of it. God is at work in our holy conferencing about budgets, buildings, communications, and nominations for church offices, just as much as in our services of worship and our works of justice and mercy out in the community. That same theology is why every year there is a Sunday set aside for Laity Sunday, a time when the non-clerical members of each congregation design and run an entire worship service from soup to nuts, from prelude to coffee hour. Laity Sunday is meant to highlight that the church is the people in it. To have a building with a steeple is not to have a church. The church, as we sang, is a people. We are here by the fourth house of worship that our church has inhabited. There was one first in the home of our founder, Lucinda Mason, next in a wooden church downtown, then in a rented hall, and now we're here. And we have called ourselves by many names across those years. The Methodist Episcopal Society of Winchester, Crawford Memorial Methodist Church, and now Crawford Memorial United Methodist Church. The Second Congregational Church in Winchester has also existed in multiple locations and now has joined us here. All that closed was a legal entity and the name and location that went with it. But the church is very much open and alive, and both that church and our church have grown by joining our callings together, and we now feast at the same table as one body in Christ. The same theology exists in the structure of how pastors come and go in the United Methodist Church. In our system, pastors are not called by churches, and congregations don't pick them or vote on them. Instead, pastors are sent by the bishop and the cabinet, which are those district superintendents who help the bishop discern what a given church needs at any particular time. In a letter to the Reverend Samuel Walker in 1756, John Wesley wrote this: "We have found by long and consistent experience that a frequent exchange of preachers is best. This preacher has one talent, that another. No one whom I ever yet knew has all the talents which are needful for beginning, continuing, and perfecting the work of grace in a whole congregation." Close quote. In the earliest days of Methodism in this country, an ordained clergyman might be appointed to half a state or more, with that territory changing every 3 months. The job of the ordained clergy then was to create new societies of lay people, and then to travel to those societies to administer the sacraments, to marry, to baptize, and all that. The real work of keeping those societies running, growing, and spiritually transforming, including the preaching at all the meetings in between the seldom visits by the ordained circuit rider, which was once a month or less, was done by the laity in each society. As societies became churches and clergy were appointed to a specific church rather than to a region, the system changed, but not by a lot. Within my lifetime, Methodist clergy were moved every 1 to 3 years, and nobody knew if or when they were moving until the appointments were read at annual conference. And by the next Sunday, whoever was moving, which was at least a third of them every year, had to pack up and be in their new appointment in their new pulpit the following week. Although the usual time in a place has been extended, our appointments are actually technically still only for 1 year. Every single year, the Staff Parish Relations Committee has to fill out a form for the conference to indicate what missional reasons there are for either keeping or moving their pastor. And every pastor has a separate form to send in every year with our own take on why we think it's best for the church for us to either stay or move. One of the things unique to the pastor's form is the question, do you intend to retire in the next 2 years? And for the first time this year, my form will answer yes to that question and will indicate my intention to seek retirement on June 30th, 2027. So 2 years from tomorrow. Now, a lot can happen across 2 years, especially in a society on as rocky a road as we are. And God has laughed at my intentions before and could again. But I'm giving you that information 2 years out for a reason. With our church council beginning to find its way with our new structure that we adopted last fall, we're trying to discern as a body the calling of the people called Crawford. One out of the myriad directions, ministries, and missions that are needed in this world, what are the ones that uniquely fit us here at Crawford? Where do we have holes in our ministry that need filling? What are our strengths? What should be the priorities that guide the allocation of our resources, from our human resources to our property to our financial assets? At our meeting a couple of weeks ago, we decided that questions of such importance should not be decided by church council alone, that we needed some holy conferencing with the whole church before picking a direction. We decided to solicit that input from small groups that everyone will be able to sign up for this summer. They'll be at different days and times, both in person and virtual. You'll even have a chance just to write something out and send it in if you don't feel like meeting with a group. We want everyone who has something to say to have the right format for them to say it. Then, after learning of my decision to target 2027 as my own retirement a couple weeks ago, Staff Parish decided that those groups could also serve a critical function related to their job in preparing for that eventual change. United Methodist congregations do not have a say in the specific person who's appointed to a church. There's a big fuzzy thing for this somewhere. But so congregations don't pick the person. You don't get to interview people or whatever. As an example, I knew that I was coming to Crawford before any of you even knew that Hope was leaving. She called the bishop called me. And so that's how our structure works. But a congregation can have a significant impact on who the bishop and cabinet consider sending by creating a strong and thoughtful church profile, which is the document that Staff Parish creates for the conference every year. That church profile not only says whether the church would like a change in pastor or not, it has very broad questions about the town where each church is located, about the local congregation and its vision, mission, and ministry, about the qualities of a pastor that are most important to a particular congregation. There's even a list of something like 12 things that pastors typically do, and Staff Parish has to pick just 8 of the 12 and then rank those 8 in order of importance for this church. And I get that same list independently to do my own ranking. And some of our discussions are at Staff Parish are when I said, our lists don't match. That church profile and the profiles that every pastor does for themselves are what the bishop and the cabinet use to decide who is going to go where. The more thought and input that goes into that church profile, the more likely it is that a congregation will get the pastor who is best suited for their needs. Since the church profile is submitted every year at our fall church conference, we decided that the group's church council was already planning to give input about the direction of the church, could add a couple of questions about pastoral leadership, and thereby provide both groups with robust data to create a detailed and accurate and helpful church profile, so that when the bishop and cabinet read it, they will know exactly the kind of pastor that they are looking for. And the sooner they have that, the better. For instance, if the perfect pastor for Crawford asked to move next year in 2026, the bishop could say, this is a really good match for Crawford. Can you hang on there for one more year? Because that church, the perfect church for you, is going to come open in 2027. Can you possibly hang on where you are for one more year? There is a reason they ask clergy for a 2-year window into retirement plans. The further ahead they know something, the more they can absorb that and think it through and keep an eye out for the right person. You will be getting announcements about groups and how to sign up in the next week or so. But since they will begin while I'm away on vacation and continue then through the summer, I wanted you to know my plans so that you could appreciate the importance of finding a group to attend or in some other way give your input. And then, come fall, we'll have 2 more years together to lay the foundation on which the next pastor with a different set of gifts and graces will build. But they will not build alone. That is not how the church works. Churches become dysfunctional when the pastor is the paid Christian to do all the things. It takes everybody. I am the church. You are the church. We are the church together in one body with Christ as our head, meeting at the table where Jesus is host.